Hello there and welcome to Bruxelles Je t'aime, Euronews' weekly talk show about European affairs. On Brussels, my love, we take a look at some stories that hit the headlines of late, find out what's at stake for you and for Europe. My name is Maeve McMahon, thanks for joining us. Coming up this week, Turkey elects. Tipped as one of the most important votes of 2023, the NIFEG elections brought about no winner, and millions of Turks at home and abroad will vote again at the end of May. With so much at stake for Europe when it comes to migration, trade and geopolitics, we hear why Brussels is watching so closely. And spring has sprung in Europe, and with it some encouraging new data from the European Commission about the state of the European economy. Growth looks good in countries like Ireland and Greece, countries that a decade ago were knee-deep in debt. But with the cost of living crisis seeing the higher production costs passed on to consumers, we're asking if this economic data will make any difference to our lives. To talk about these stories and much more, we're joined here in our studio by Marisa Matias, the Portuguese MEP from the Left Group, Murat Seyrek, Professor at VUP and Brussels School of Governance, following Turkey-EU relations for 2 decades, more or less. Good to have you with us. Ricardo Borges de Castro, Associate Director at the European Policy Centre, a PhD in Turkey relations, I believe.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, so we have the best, most informed people on Turkey here with us around the table. So thank you so much for joining us. Now, the Turks have gone to the polls and they will go again, as I said, on the 28th of May. The two presidential rivals, Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, are hoping to both become president. Both have to compete in a runoff election after they both failed to win 50% of the vote. A third candidate, Sinan Oğan, took 5%. So all eyes, of course, on where his votes will go. Let's start perhaps with yourself, Murat. What do you think will happen?
Well, I guess first we need to put the results in context. I mean, the opposition candidates got 50.5%. And Erdogan didn't manage to go over 50%. This alone, I think, is a success considering especially the conditions in Turkey. I mean, we are talking about major issues in terms of democracy, rule of law, and the election was not really happening in a fair environment because Erdogan was using the entire state machinery and the mainstream media as well. And despite all this, if this is happening, I think we need to recognize that it's a major success for millions of Democrats in Turkey who have been tirelessly working day and night. I mean, the election day, the first round, hundreds of thousands of young people volunteered to secure the ballot boxes. So this alone, I think, is really very important for the future of country. I think it's really the sound of a liberal democracy loading in Turkey, no matter what happens in the second round. That's why I think we need to recognize this, because I think in Europe, many people claim that democracy in Turkey is dead. It is not dead, and I think it's a major insult to all these people, millions of people, really hoping, and not only hoping, but really volunteering, doing something about this as we speak here today. So that's really important, I believe.
Liberal democracy unloading in Turkey. Would you agree with that assessment, Ricardo? And what do you think could happen?
What for me is significant is the high turnout. I mean, Turks like to vote. They went to the polls. They wanted to express their views about the country. As for the, I mean, I don't want to go back to my PhD where I had to sort of to deal with many definitions of what, Turkish democracy is. I think there is a process, in procedural terms, democracy is working in Turkey. And I believe that in the substance of things, there is also a lot of debate. Democracy to a certain extent is a vibrant process. But of course, I mean, we have seen the trends and we have seen the events of past years that, jailing of journalists, of academicians, of politicians even. So I think we need to see, Turkey to a certain, I always use this expression, it's a little bit of Europeans with Turkey is a sort of a difficult love affair. You can't live with them, but we can't live without them. And so I think these are a little bit some of the issues that sometimes come into these debates.
A little bit later we can elaborate on that love affair, that complicated love affair. But first let's get the view from the Left Group, from yourself, Portuguese MEP, and tell us how you've been watching these elections very closely and what your take is.
I think everyone, as you said in the beginning, everyone was looking with a lot of attention to these elections, and we still are, because it's for sure one of the most important elections in 2023. and that's for sure for all the issues already raised and others. As it was said also, we knew that this election would not take place in an even playing field. On the contrary, it was said. And when you look to the data, you see that in the last month, the main TV channel, the TRT, broadcasted 32 hours of the president of Erdogan and just 32 minutes of the main opposition leader, which says everything about what was the type of information that people were getting. I think that from the European perspective, you said the migration issues and other issues, these are at stake, but for sure are at stake other issues, I think in particular the external relations. What was the role of Erdogan in the last years, especially, and how he was approaching Putin, for instance, how this deviated somehow, how did he construct a more, let us say, post-Ottoman approach to the political relations, external relations, than it was before. So I think a lot of things are at stake, but I think it was already a huge lesson of democracy for sure.
And of course, what's very interesting here is there's, I think, is it 5 million Turkish diaspora as well based here in Europe, Murat? And many of them, in fact, here in Brussels. Many of them have commerce near about 50-minute walk here from the EU quarter of Brussels on a street called Chaussée de Acht. And I was there earlier this week having a chat with them to see, were they voting? Was it the talk of the town? And what way they wanted those elections to go. Take a listen.
Now that the election have been prolonged, we have to vote again. I find it a bit strange because I already voted. I already queued up. What's going to change?
For me, there's nothing that will change. I think we're exaggerating a bit, especially the Europeans.
I voted for Tayyip Erdogan because I like him. He's like my father, my grandfather. So I hope we will have a great celebration for Turkey and Tayyip Erdogan.
Just a taste of the opinions there. And many people wouldn't speak on camera. They were camera shy, but they told me they were very much in favour of seeing no change in Turkey, that they still wanted to see Erdogan stay exactly where he was.
I mean, I would say my reaction to that, also then having lived in the country, I mean, Erdogan had also a good face. I mean, and he has lifted many Turks also out of poverty, he has provided economic opportunity, has provided social services, at least as I could see. Of course, then, I mean, with all the issues that then are associated with this, of corruption, of nepotism, all of I mean, Turkey, in a sense, it's also a very complex country. And also, I think there's another element, to a certain extent, when I was studying there, when I was doing my research, that we always had this debate whether Turkey was becoming more religious or religion was becoming more visible, because he also opened up the society to other shades of Turks that before probably were not so predominant. So I think there's also been a positive side of the story. Now, I mean, that positive side of the story has been undermined by Erdogan himself for many in the last few years.
Let's bring in Murat, a reaction there to what you've heard and what you've heard exactly in that clip as well.
Well, I mean, 3 million people are voting abroad. Actually, 3 million of them are registered, but 1.5 million voted in the first round. That's something also we shouldn't miss. You rightly said there are 5 million Turks in EU countries, and actually 6 million including the Turkish minorities as well, like including in Bulgaria. And it makes actually, if you really combine the total amount, is bigger than many European countries. I think, if I'm not wrong, 13 of them. So that's already very big.
Bigger than ours, bigger than Ireland, bigger than Portugal.
Yes.
Yeah.
Indeed. Of course, what they think matters. But on the other hand, we shouldn't, I think, make big conclusions out of this as well, because, for example, in German media, we see it very, very regularly. But also we see that, for example, only 47% of the Turks in Germany actually voted. So it means that majority of the Turks in Europe, in the Western European countries, are not actually pro-Erdogan. They're apolitical. They don't really care about what's happening there. They don't really vote. They don't even register to vote, many of them. So that part we shouldn't forget. And then there are, of course, many reasons why these people are voting for Erdogan. First of all, of course, there are some sociological reasons about where they come from. Secondly, they have all these issues about because they've always felt discriminated in Europe, and they feel like Erdogan is like their hero because, like, he had really courage to say no to Europe and to speak up as well. But thirdly as well, because all these political Islamist movements, when the Turkey was much more secular, they were actually organized in Europe, in the European countries. I mean, Milli Görüş, where Erdogan comes from, actually, the center has always been Germany, for example. So they were much more organized, and they had this opportunity to reach out to these people in an organized way. So I think that's also one of the reasons. While we are really complaining about this, because in some countries they do, we should also recognize the fact that we also allow the political Islam to be very active in our territories for such a long time.
Interesting there, that clip, to see how much support Erdogan has in some parts of Brussels, but in others, here in the EU quarter, not so much really.
Yeah, but I think what was said just now, it's quite important. I mean, the majority, or about at least half of the population outside Turkey, they don't participate. And so the turnout in Turkey is huge, but then you have this huge difference. People are not probably so attached to it. And then, of course, the type of analysis that we do, I think they don't say much to the regular citizens. I mean, when we say, okay, because what are the differences which might be at stake? For instance, we saw over 20 years Erdogan concentrating a lot of power, removing the capacity of decision from the parliament and putting everything on his umbrella, under his umbrella. And we see now, as something new in Turkey, the fact that the opposition was united, and you had this national alliance, and you engaged minorities as well. And there's this promise of giving back to the parliament some power and make it more democratic. Okay, perhaps for this it's not so relevant. It's much more relevant for the people, I think, talking about inflation, the outcome of the earthquake, and things like that. So, okay, we do a lot of high-level analysis, but we also need to take into account that for regular people, things sometimes are much simpler in terms of the analysis which is made.
Of course. But there's a lot, of course, at stake.
Of course, there's a lot of at stake. I don't know. I think that some of the things will not change that much, but of course we are talking in all countries. Every time you have elections, it's really rare when you have a huge, deep transformation. So, but I think that, yeah, in terms of what is the possibilities that will be open in a different scenario and not in such permanent tension relationship. And also, I think that the big question mark is, will it change anything, for instance, in the relation with Putin or not, and the Ukraine? I don't know that, to be honest, but I think that's one of the big question marks that we have.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're obviously speculating here because we don't have the outcome, but what could change if there was a change?
I mean, I think what would change, that would be, for me, very important, is first, and that would be my expectation, first is this point that was just made, that probably a recalibration of powers, of the system of powers within Turkey, more towards the parliament, certainly, but also, for example, the release of so many of the political prisoners that are now in jail, people that I've met that supported Erdogan at the time, 2008, 2009, and now have been put in jail. So I think this movement to release these people more, and in a sense, foster again, civil liberties, the rights of minorities, LGBT community, women rights. I think all of these issues would be, I would say, okay, maybe it would not be sort of an overnight progress, but I think there could be change here. And this would also, and then I think we might also need to talk about that, this will also put the EU in a tight spot, because then the EU needs to approach Turkey probably in a different fashion. And if I were to be a cynic, I'm not sure that the EU is actually ready to deal with an opposition government in Turkey.
Well, that's an interesting point. Murat, what's your take on that?
Well, unfortunately, it is true. I mean, for many leaders, I think, in Europe, it's not so undesirable to have Erdogan, because then you don't need difficult decisions.
You have always an excuse. I'm sorry.
I mean, we have been talking about all the democratic issues in Turkey, rule of law, fundamental rights, but I believe that all those issues, they were very convenient excuses for many European politicians to avoid a difficult question about Turkey. So if Kılıçdaroğlu is elected, actually it would also open the Pandora's box, because then you have a big question of what do you do with Turkey, especially a Turkey moving towards more democracy, fundamental rights, and EU values. So what do you do, and how can you decide, actually? Because what you can do with Turkey without re-energizing the accession process is very limited, actually.
And a very divided Turkey. Well, it brings us on, of course, to the topic of Turkish potential EU membership. I mean, it's obviously been on hold since 2018, since an EU summit declaration said that they would pause the talks. Is that something you think that could ever happen one day?
I really don't know, but I think that will depend more on the will from the Turkish side rather than anything else. And of course, there was a different approach to the subject made by Erdogan and his leadership, but I don't know. In any case, it will depend on the will of Turkish
and
people.
The focus, of course, in this town is the potential entry of Ukraine and the implications of that. Is it something, Murat, that the Turks actually want?
More and more, I guess. I think a few years ago, the support to EU membership was down to like 40%, and nowadays we see that again 65, even 70%, because people really got tired of all these policies of neo-Ottoman, like Middle East, etc. They're like, we don't want Middle East. We would like to live like in the European countries. There's a strong demand actually, because we always think that it's all about economy, and yes, economy is important, but especially for young people, I think fundamental rights and freedoms and living in a free society, that's really important, and there's a strong demand for this.
And we all remember the trip of the former French President Nicolas Sarkozy when he was in Ankara a few years ago and upset a lot of people, saying that they will never, ever join France, doesn't want to see. What's your take on that?
I mean, my take on this is that the EU has also not been very serious with the Turks on many occasions. So, and expectations had been also frustrated, right? So I think we also need to keep that in mind. But what I would say is that this strategy that we're just, or this expectation that the EU thinks that it can sort of, it's better off with Erdogan than with the opposition. In the long term, this is a losing strategy. This is a losing strategy for the EU. I think irrespective of who wins the elections, the EU needs to devise new policies, a new sort of engagement with Turkey, call it selective engagement, but we do need to be, and it does not only have to be at the level of the executive, of governments, it needs to be also at the level of parliaments, potentially also at the level of society. And I think this is a really key issue, because what I find is that many of these people that are now again more supportive to the EU, they really need EU support to be able to carry on with their lives.
Yeah, it was quite useful for the European Union, I mean, especially at the level of migration policies, to have such a leadership in Turkey. And then you always have an excuse, We just did an agreement, then we cannot control anything else, but which was really unacceptable. It's not only by fault of Erdogan, for sure. It's, of course, the European approach, which is quite questionable on this domain.
And the Parliament, though, you have a take. I saw there was a statement put out by the European Parliament just after that vote saying that the European Parliament would not be observing the elections or commenting on these elections.
Yeah.
And we saw the the parliamentary delegation for Turkey saying that they were peaceful but not on level playing field. I understand that the parliamentarians were not invited to observe the elections.
The election observation, of course, has always to be following an invitation from the institutions of the country. You cannot just simply appear. That would be a very colonial approach to elections. So, of course, you need to have an invitation. There was no invitation from...
The OSCE was there.
Yes. And I think that what you said just in the beginning, the young people engaging and staying up and participating in the counting, I think that's quite interesting, as well as to see that people are really interested, and that there was at least some hope channel which opened. Of course, if it is possible to be a concrete result in the second round, that is a different discussion.
So I mean, because there are also all these claims about in Europe that the election will be rigged anyway, Erdogan will win anyway. Those are also sort of insults, because I think there are mistakes in the opposition side, but I think in general it's very well organized, and civil society organizations by young people, they've been very active as well. And the system is quite clear. I mean, as long as you have representatives on top of every ballot box, as long as you know the result and you have the election report signed, you can control everything, because there were some irregularities and they are being corrected now. So in that way, I think it's not fair, but we can talk about largely free elections in Turkey.
So young people very mobilised, and women as well also, no?
Yeah, I mean, you saw that, but as I was saying, Turks go to vote. I mean, the historic trend is that the average turnout is around 81%, on the data that I saw. But I would say there's another element, and I think the next weeks will tell, which is the nationalist element, which is growing in Turkey. And this will actually, if Mr. Erdogan wins, might give him more trouble in terms of the policies that he wants to follow.
Okay, knife-edge elections. We will keep you updated on the outcome on the 28th of May. Thank you so much for your insights. Stay with us here on Euronews. Welcome back to Brussels, My Love, Euronews' weekly talk show that aspires to analyse and gather some different perspectives on some of the European stories in the spotlight this week. I'm Maeve McMahon. Now, this week, the European Commission presented its spring economic forecast, and the prognosis looks better than previously expected. GDP in the EU is set to reach 1% in 2023 and 1.7% in 2024. That's a few percentage points up than previously thought. Your reaction to that news? Did you follow it?
Yeah, I'm very critical about all this macroeconomic approach in the European Union. I mean, the indicators which are always taken as a basis, the percentage of the debt or the deficit, and using only the GDP as the base. So I think whatever we can have a better forecast, but the structural dimensions of society are still there.
But it's interesting because countries like Ireland, Greece, Portugal, countries that were bailed out many years ago, were coming up quite high on the ranking.
Yeah, but we also know how much the inequalities rose, how much these people in these countries suffer, for instance, low wages and things like that. And how much the public services were deteriorated just to follow these rules and these indications. We have a very good example. I mean, these rules had to be suspended during the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. So that's because they don't work in any situation of crisis. They don't work, period. So why to just go back to this approach? That's my big question. I still have the hope that we would not go back there, but...
Briefly?
I mean, I would, to a certain extent, I agree. I mean, it's good to have positive news on the macroeconomic side of things, but maybe if we talk with average families, small businesses, they don't feel that yet, or it's not yet in their pockets, so to say.
Well, look, let's head over to Athens. We spoke earlier this week to our Greek correspondent, Samila Tuchedo, and she told us what the situation in Greece was like, because actually there's been headlines in the papers all week about how Greece is thriving. So we wanted to hear from the ground. Take a listen.
Numbers thrive in Greece in the past 2 years. Once the pandemic restrictions were lifted, the economy had a strong rebound, with tourism overperforming and reaching pre-pandemic crisis levels. Furthermore, Greece has managed to attract a record number of foreign investments, and its exports have been steadily increasing. Unemployment has eased, though it still stands above 10% of the Greek workforce. Now to a gloomier picture. Inflation has hit households hard. Prices have skyrocketed in most basic necessities, especially food. Increased interest rates put pressure on borrowers, and many fear a new wave of non-performing loans is coming. To deal with all that, most parties promise better wages. Wages in Greece remain subdued, with the average gross pay being less than €1,200 per month.
So the proof there, Murat, that the reality on the ground, despite this positive outlook, is in fact still very difficult and will be for a long time.
Yeah, I think there are two sides of the story. On the one hand, yes, it's a success in a way that, okay, you did a lot for reducing the dependency on Russia, and we were expecting long-term consequences. And if we are back to growth, it's a good news. But are we going to reflect this to ordinary people? Because there's a reduction in the purchasing power of people, and it's a really incredible difficulty for millions of Europeans, actually. So how are we going to solve this issue, help those people, also help the small and medium-sized enterprises? So that's the major challenge, because EU had mistakes, including Russia, and then these people shouldn't be the victims of these mistakes. I mean, if the growth is back...
People are the victims now. The big costs, the major costs of production have been passed on to us, the consumers. Yep. Very briefly, what could be the solution?
I mean, I think the solution here is really I think we need to probably rethink our growth model. Also because we are, in a sense, in a process of transitioning to a paradigm that I would call, or that we have been calling, economic security. And I think the challenge here is how do you move from, let's say, a paradigm of openness and trade and exchange to a paradigm of economic security without undermining prosperity, but more than that, welfare, the welfare of general citizens. Because in the issues that Murat was just referring to, you need to continue to have the support of European citizens to all the difficult decisions that Europeans need to do to face with the geopolitical conditions.
Yeah, I mean, during these days, we are having this huge conference on post-growth perspectives and solutions, and I think that's the way. I mean, in one session, Joseph Stiglitz was saying a very important thing, which is that there was this old idea that if you have growth, that would translate into the well-being of citizens. And it's not true, and people know it. So even that you have a forecast that says that there will be a huge growth in the next year, it will not be absorbed by the people.
Just to contextualise there for our viewers, this week in Brussels, 2,000 people were in the European Parliament. They occupied the building to discuss degrowth and the future of post-capitalism.
Yeah, and
among them was the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, and she spoke a little bit outside the box. We can take a listen.
The growth model centred on fossil fuels is simply obsolete. This assessment has been confirmed time and again. The recent IPCC report is just the latest reminder that we need to decarbonise our economies as quickly as possible.
Murat, your take, is the growth model obsolete?
Well, apparently it is, and we need to find a way to redistribute also all this growth as well. I think that's the major problem.
And was this a major statement from Ursula von der Leyen, do you think?
Yes, I think. I mean, it was quite surprising, to be honest, because everything we have seen over the last years was not in this direction. On the contrary, we are rescuing the old rules, as we were speaking about. We changed our taxonomy in order to include gas and things like that, which are totally in the line of the dependence of fossil fuels and things like that. So it was quite surprising. But I think that as she committed in the front of so many young people, and it was really something, that we were not expecting. So I think that it has to mean something. At least we can now say, okay, let's go and do this way, because
it should not be degrowth. I think it's very important that we also keep in mind that our societies, if we want to have a tax base, if we want to be able also to continue providing.
But the post-growth model is not that then people will live worse. No, is that more people live better.
Taking other considerations.
Taking well-being as a key sentence.
But in my view, is not the
solution. It's a fascinating discussion.
Yep.
You can watch, in fact, we did a debate on the topic earlier this week, and you can catch it on Euronews this weekend. But for now, thank you so much to our guests here for your insights, and thank you so much for watching. We'll see you soon here on Euronews and, of course, Euronews.com. Welcome back to Brussels, my love, Euronews' weekly talk show about the week that was. Well, one story that caught our eye was the French National Assembly voting to make it compulsory to fly the EU flag in local town halls across the country. 130 lawmakers voted in favour, 109 against. An idea of Emmanuel Macron. It means the flag that has 12 gold stars and a blue background and is meant to stand for unity would stand alongside the French flag. The bill must, of course, now pass in a vote in the French Senate before coming law. Have you seen the news? What do you think? Is it a good idea?
I mean, in Portuguese, we have this expression, which is nin, which is a combination of yes and no.
Like
so I'm a little bit ambivalent about this, because I don't think it would be better if this was a voluntary gesture from all the localities and regions that actually maybe some of them receive European Union funds. So
voluntary, not mandatory.
Yeah.
What's your take?
Well, I still believe in Europe, and I like Europe, and seeing more flags wouldn't bother me, and it's a big but, that we shouldn't be imposing such rules to make people like EU, rather than that we need to re-engage with people, explain the EU, explain the benefits of the EU, because EU has been doing a lot for EU citizens, but we are failing to explain. We should create that environment so that they will do it voluntarily, actually.
Fully agree.
I would agree with a lot of critics in France. I mean, I think that in this moment, Macron would do anything just not to discuss the reform policy and not to talk with people on the streets demonstrating. So it's just a fait divers, that's a pity that these things are treated as a fait divers.
Well, as I said there, 109 lawmakers did vote against the plan. Some of them were furious, like Jean-Philippe Tanguy. He's a French MP from the far-right Rassemblement National. Take a listen.
There are only 3 colours that French people will bow to, that French people will use to pay respect to the dead in their schools, in official ceremonies. The blue, the white and the red. These 12 stars on the European flag have no meaning. You don't even know where it comes from. You just try to justify the past with the present. Since when do we justify a symbol allegedly being a present one without taking root in the past? It doesn't make any sense.
Jean-Philippe Tanguy there. I guess this is just a taste of the divisive politics we will see next year when those European elections will take place. We had the date confirmed this week. They will take place from the 6th to the 9th of June 2024. Will Europeans care? That is the question.
Let's see. For my country, it's a very bad date. I mean, because the turnout is really low for the European elections. Of course, we have to work more to increase the participation, but just before 2 major holidays is not. It doesn't seem really good. But I mean, if there was no agreement, we would know that the law would apply, and the law says always about the first week of June. So.
No, and I think, we won't get the turnout at the level of Turkey in these elections, for sure. But I think what it is important is really that, the candidates to the European Parliament do spend time, advocating for Europe and explaining what happens here in those elections, because a lot of it also will depend on economic and social situation, and also where the war is and where are we at that moment. So I think there's a lot of factors that will play into these elections. I would say these would be one of the most European parliamentary elections of the past few years.
The most important, Murat, briefly?
I think it's important, but on the other hand, I think that the major failure is that we cannot really explain people that this election is also about their future, because EU is deciding also on their future, but somehow people care more about the local politics and the national politics than the EU. And that's also, I think, one of the failures of Brussels as well, because we need to reach out to those people to tell them why Europe matters for them as well.
Well, hopefully we're filling a little bit of that gap here on Brussels, my love. That is what we attempt to do, give lots of different perspectives on all the various different, very complex European topics. But thank you so much to our guests for being with us. Murat, come back to us in a few weeks, please, when we have more on those elections, when we don't just get to speculate, we can talk more on facts. But that is, I'm afraid, all we have time for. Do send us an email if you like. It's brusselsmylove@euronews.com if you have any comments or feedback for us or any topics that you would like to see us cover. We're also on Twitter and Instagram, so reach out to us there too. And we see you soon here on Euronews and euronews.com.